Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the seminar on writing social theory, organized by the Canadian Sociological Association's Social Theory Research Cluster in collaboration with the Student Concerns Subcommittee. Before we begin, we wish to situate our presence as uninvited guests on the traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across so-called Canada. This acknowledgement is to recognize the enduring relationships that exist between Indigenous nations and their territories that the CSA and its constituents work and live on. We strive to understand our role within Canada's ongoing settler colonial project that subjects Indigenous peoples to dispossession and genocide. We recognize our participation and complacency in colonial modalities and knowledge systems, and are committed to decolonial praxis that centers and affirms the contributions of Indigenous elders and scholars to the field of sociology. So that everyone is aware, audience members are muted to limit background noise. If you do have questions that come up during the seminar, please submit those using the Q&A function. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists, and audience members may also upvote questions for priority. The panelists will address those questions during the open Q&A period. Our moderator for today's webinar is Dean Ray. Dean is a cultural sociologist with a specialization in Indigenous studies and critical sexualities. He examines how Indigenous and queer communities use culture to resist settler colonial states. Dean's research is ethnographic, qualitative, and archival, and draws on social psychological insights to unmap and decolonize solidarity, oppression, and resistance. So I'll just turn things over to Dean now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Awish. I just want to thank everybody for being here. It is my belief that theory is an essential tool for creating social and cultural change. And I think that writing theory is one of the most important aspects of communicating sociological ideas that have within them the power to reshape our world. And so I just want to thank all of the panelists for being here today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. So we have Dr. Zohreh Bayatrizi. She is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Alberta, and she's been there since 2008. And next we have Dr. Katherine Bischoping, who's an associate professor of sociology at York University. Next, we have Dr. Thomas Kempel. He's a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Renisa Mawani, a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. And Dr. Neil McLaughlin, who teaches theory at McMaster University as a full professor. Awesome. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Thomas Kempel.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Sherry for coordinating us beforehand. So hopefully this all goes off smoothly, and especially to Dean for inviting us here. So thinking about the topic on writing theory, I've always done theory as my main specialty. So that is somewhat unusual, not so much for people who were at the graduate program in social and political thought in the 1980s and 90s, where I did my graduate work, but increasingly less common nowadays, where theory is a component, but not its own, necessarily its own 100% full-time specialty. But it is for me. I want to start with an anecdote from a colleague here at UBC, who is, I would say, more empirical, even empiricist oriented. And this colleague said to me that they thought that writing theory was writing and thinking without examples. And that kind of struck me, because I think I'm always working and thinking with examples, but even looking at maybe a given paragraph of one of my books or an article, there might not necessarily be an example in any one of those paragraphs, or perhaps even over the stretch of a few pages. But I am always thinking with examples. That made me also imagine the different ways in which you can encounter theory in different journals. So on the one side, we might have a journal like Theory and Society, where the typical article is fairly evenly split between a theory part 1 and an empirical case study part 2. Often, in fact, the theory part is shorter than the case study itself. In contrast, take a journal like Sociological Theory, where a concept or a set of concepts or a theoretical tradition will be interrogated through the entire article, often with a few or several examples, kind of grounding each of those theoretical points being made in an article in a journal like Sociological Theory. By contrast, when we go to the other side of the Atlantic with a journal like the European Journal of Social Theory, there's often a theme that runs through an entire issue, or a theme that runs through a particular article or cluster of articles. And maybe at the most extreme is a journal that I contribute to, Theory, Culture, and Society, which is edited out of Britain, where certain kinds of key words, key thinkers are going to be front and center more than any particular empirical question or topic. Well, I think all of those are valid and good ways of writing and doing and thinking theory. My own approach when I'm mentoring grad students who are going to have empirical topics for the most part that will be outside my my own field of expertise. So I'm there mainly to advise them on the theoretical framing and inspiration of their overall argument. But what I often tell students is that I don't believe in a standalone theory chapter or a standalone theory section. Now, that's a bit unorthodox. It's often against the grain of colleagues that I have to work with in committees. And when I do tell students that, I don't mean that you shouldn't signal your theoretical commitments and your what theories and concepts you're using early on or in one distinct place in your thesis or in your term paper or whatever you happen to be writing. Rather, what I mean is that a theory does need to be present in some way throughout the stretch of the essay or the chapter or the thesis as a whole. So it can't just be something that you just dump onto a page, in my view, and then leave behind, never to return to it again, except maybe at the defense or, you know, when you're questioned on it by committee members in some future date. Also, I tell students that I don't really think of theory exclusively or even primarily as a way of testing hypotheses. Now, again, that's a bit unorthodox. I think that theory is something that underlies a whole argument that you're making. You may be testing hypotheses, you're certainly formulating research questions, but the theory itself is not necessarily a set of it can't necessarily be dismantled into statements that you then test. It's not only that. It needs to inform, I think, the entire argument and thesis that you're making. And finally, I don't really think of theory exclusively or primarily as as something that you apply. Okay, it often informs and it often emerges from a set of empirical questions, examples, data, but it's not necessarily only what you apply, as if it's coming from the outside and being sort of slapped on like the icing on a cake. I do work with metaphors, and I know that Kathy's going to talk a bit about that. So often what I do is work with examples that are in the text itself. And often the examples are formulated by a thinker in terms of images and metaphors. So I'm going to conclude just by showing you very quickly by sharing my screen. One of the diagrams, concept diagrams that I've used in my own work. Is this working? Yes. So this is my diagram of Georg Zimmel's famous essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life from 1903. I've used this in my recent book, and it's sort of plotting out the key concepts. Well, the metropolis and mental life on the one hand, and then going down on the right and the left and the right of my diagram, the associated themes and concepts that he discusses with a real wide variety of examples, going down all the way to his main theoretical contribution, which is this tension or dichotomy between what he calls the hypertrophy of objective culture in the red on the left there versus the atrophy of individual culture. So what I invite you to do is to try to think of how you might even plot out some of your key ideas, if not in the form of a metaphor or an image, in some other kind of concept diagram. And I'm going to leave it there and pass it on to my colleague, Kathy.
Thanks very much. Thank you all. I'm excited to be here. I'm here as a theory prof who is also primarily a methodologist, an oral historian and a narrative analyst specifically. And I'm following Thomas because I too have that fascination with metaphor and wish to elaborate on it. And last, I'm following as a person who has just been reading some lovely works by Ruba Ali Al-Hassani, Fazia Hussein, and Sarah Swerdlick, who I'm so looking forward to seeing in the workshop. And these are works that beautifully engage with and illustrate aspects of theory that I'll be speaking about: storytelling and, yes, metaphor. So what use is metaphor to theorists? Let's consider Muhammad Ali, best heavyweight boxer ever and one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, who famously said that he floats like a butterfly, stings like a bee. In so saying, Muhammad Ali re-enchants the sport of boxing. What seems to those of us outside it, and I speak as somebody who as a kid heard him say this, and what had seemed like just a forceful, fast-paced, rather violent sport became transformed through Ali's imaginative use of language, through his metaphor, into a sport that suddenly was engaged with a kind of gentle lyricism and very delicate precision. So here's a beautiful example of how metaphor works, how metaphor can resonate with us and transform our view of the world in imaginative ways. And I think of metaphor for us as theorists as a way to re-enchant a social problem or a situation, as a way that enlightens us, and as a way that can persuade us, persuade our readers, which is what we're hoping to do. So I'd like to just give a little overview of some of the most spectacular metaphors in sociological history, like when Karl Marx called communism a specter haunting Europe that all the old powers have joined forces to exercise. When Max Weber called rationality a steel-like cupboard that encases us, which his translator, Talcott Parsons, then converted into the iron cage of rationality. When Emil Durkheim called suicide as something arising from a current of collective emotion, giving us this collective current that could overpower an individual and sweep her away. When W.E.B. Du Bois said that Black Americans are as if born with a call, a veil that gives them this mysterious second sight into white American perspectives. When Irving Goffman gave us front stage and backstage, and here, let me shout out the backstage consummate organizers and folks who are making this session happen: Dean Ray, Sherry Fox, and Awish Aslam. Thank you all very much. Back to my list, when Audre Lorde gave us a book entitled The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And when Ngugi wa Thiong'o said that imperialism's greatest weapon was a cultural bomb that, quote, annihilates a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. Each one of these metaphors re-enchants a social problem or intellectual puzzle. Each one of them persuades by grounding some sheer abstraction. How do we understand imperialism? Some sheer abstraction of people's lived experiences put in terms of a familiar image that evokes concrete senses in us. So we can feel the haunting of a specter, an iron cage, a current, a veil, a stage, a toolbox, or a bomb. And though not all theory writing needs to or be or is centrally about metaphor, we can become alert as theory writers to how metaphors are used in the discourses that surround us and to the fine details of the language through which we speak our social life. For example, every morning I look at epidemiologists' reports about COVID, and this morning, because of this talk, I was struck by the question of what it means to use the metaphor of a wave to talk about the different phases of the COVID pandemic. So looking at these little details of language, thinking about the theory, thinking about these metaphors can make for enlightening and re-enchanting theory writing. I want to take as an example gender study theorists Regina Bendel and Angelica Smith's question of why it matters that women and racialized people are spoken of as breaking through the glass ceiling. And this, in their analysis, they point out how this depicts barriers as singular. There's one barrier, the glass ceiling. That barrier is somehow invisible until somebody reaches it. It's above a person rather than pervasive. And the onus is on that racialized woman to triumphantly smash through that barrier, be that person who lives the liberal individual dream. The metaphor makes that dream our focus. Bendel and Schmidt, in their analysis, propose that instead we use a metaphor of a hacker, not some bad, I'm going to steal your election hacker, but a countercultural, speaking truth to power, girl with the dragon tattoo type hacker. Someone who figures out the codes of an organization, maybe involving others in her community in that process. She crafts her way past firewalls, past barriers that are invisible, but they are detectable, and actually sometimes they're very physically manifest. They're barriers that are always changing. They're more pervasive than, oh my God, there's a ceiling there. They're barriers that someone is actively constructing and maintaining, and barriers that make us, through the hacker metaphor and the firewall, ask, so who's doing this? How is that firewall being set up? And last, I want to turn to why it matters that theory be expressed in enchanting ways, with metaphor being but one of those possible enchantments. Why it matters that theory brings us not just what's new, but what charms our spirits, what enlivens our senses, and what brings us joy. And it seems strange to say what brings us joy and curiosity, even when the topic at hand is some dire one of people at their worst or most painful moments. My favorite articulation of this comes from Lee Maracle of the Stolo Nation, to whom the purpose of theory is to respond to the need for a human direction that will guarantee the peaceful coexistence of human beings with all things under creation. To Maracle, when theory writing is depersonalized, becoming some objective, dry account of how concepts interact with one another rather than people, and when theory is written in a language so abstract as to become inaccessible, then a society based upon the principles of that theory will require coercion, will need force to apply it. Badly written theory, therefore, for Maracle, it's not just boring, but it's actively dangerous. In contrast, says Maracle, when theory is expressed in terms that ordinary people can understand and is expressed through storytelling, through artistry, through metaphors, other forms of artistry, then people can become attracted to theory, willing to discuss it. They want to exchange interpretations about it. They're more likely to be inspired to buy in and to cooperate in seeing the work of that theory come to realization. This is the idea on which I leave my undergraduate theory course. And so I figure it's my mic drop moment. Thanks very much.
And next up, we have Neil McLaughlin. Who may still be muted.
All right, that was really terrific. What I want to do is do three things: talk a little bit about how I got here to theorize, how I theorize, and then looking forward to talk about how you could theorize. So how I got to theorize and become a sociologist. So I come from the Glasgow Irish diaspora, and I don't know the Irish language, and I came to Montreal, and I never learned French very well, and so I really operated in one language, and I wasn't very good at that at all. Actually, the first time I applied for graduate school, I got rejected because the writing was so bad. I was really interested at the time primarily in soccer, and I got a soccer scholarship in the United States, and I became an intellectual in the American socialist movement at a place called Cleveland State. And I was part of something called the Democratic Socialists of America, and you had Cornel West and Michael Harrington and Barbara Ehrenreich. That was the school that I really went to. And I moved to New York City to move America to the left, which was a crazy idea, and it didn't work out very well, obviously, thinking about the Trump years. And I learned to write in a magazine called Dissent magazine, which was run by someone called Irving Howe. And the first piece that I wrote for him, he said, "Neil, stop trying to impress your sociology professors and make an argument." And that has always stayed with me. And so this education in the movement, it was the place where I learned to theorize. I figured out that I needed an academic mentor, and Robert Alford wrote this book called The Craft of Inquiry. And one of the questions that people asked in the questions was about the separation of theory and method. And Alford talks about that, and the book is about designing a research question. But he once said to me, "Neil, you write like a journalist." And that was kind of like backhanded praise, really. He was trying to get me to write like an academic. And I was influenced at the time by criticisms of sort of overly academic language. And I wanted to be like Orwell, writing transparently like a pane of glass. So that's sort of how I came to this and how I theorize. So Alford's analysis in his book, he talks about action agendas, theoretical questions, and empirical questions. And I was very much influenced by an action agenda. And he taught me how to pick a research question that could be studied. And what I chose was the intellectuals that I was interested in and I wanted to be like. And I tried to study them and to write about how one writes about socialism to the public. So for me, the questions sort of picked me as opposed to me picking the question. So just give you some examples of the kinds of things that shaped all the things that I've done. I was interested in why there was no mass socialist movement in the US. So I wrote about Erich Fromm, a critical theorist, and Noam Chomsky, and how they wrote to the public in a culture that was hostile to socialism. And I was interested in why the American higher education system was pushing things away from, in my view, a left-wing America. So the people who I learned to write from were socialists who were at Harvard and at Yale and at Oberlin College, at these elite private schools. So what kind of socialist movement is dominated by elite private colleges? So there was something about America, I think, that I learned. And writing about these excluded thinkers, I wrote about the Cannon Wars. And I've been interested in sort of political and reputational costs and dangers of writing to the public, and then how this all works in Canada. So that's the that's sort of how I've been theorizing, or the kinds of things I've been theorizing. And what my theorizing is not, is it's not an internal discussion within a tradition or a theoretical approach. So I wrote about Erich Fromm, and my dissertation was called Escape from Orthodoxy. So I wrote about a critical theory, but I think that it's a failed tradition in a lot of ways. It was very much influenced by Marxism, but I think we have to be really critical of some of the assumptions in Marxism. And I believe very strongly that there's an unconscious, and that the emotions can be understood through psychoanalysis, but that tradition itself is very much flawed. So I would say that's one thing that young theorists want to think about today, or might want to think about, is do you want to be an eclectic thinker drawing from different traditions? That's sort of how I see myself. But one could also argue that is an undisciplined approach, and there's some value in thinking about that criticism. So I'll just leave that as a sort of question to. So to end, I want to talk about some paths forward and give one piece of advice, two cautions, and end on a polemic. And anyone who's read my writing will know that I do love my polemics. So the first piece of advice is that learning can be learned. I mean, I think that it is difficult if you're writing in if English or French is your second language, or the language of your people is not prioritized or given the respect that it deserves. So writing in English and French, where our journals are dominated, can be harder. And even if your English is your first language, I know for myself that I had to learn how to write. And so the key thing for that is to revise and to get networks where you can get help and learn how to take and give helpful constructive criticism. This is an enormously important skill. And I got it from just listening, actually, and just reading a lot and listening to other people and being connected with networks. So if you're not someone who's exceptional writer, you can be, and you can learn that with networks, and you have to learn it in groups with other people. It's not an individual skill at all. My two cautions, I would say, is social media can harm your writing. I think what we're seeing today is a sort of social production in a way of narcissism. We have petty squabbles on Twitter and constant self-promotion. And Twitter teaches you to operate on a journalistic timeline in short spans. I think there's a value. I'm not saying Twitter can't be useful for careers or for politics. Of course it can be. But there's a value for taking a step back from social media and thinking about how too much social media can damage your ability to write with a distance that really good writing requires. I also would say that ideology and jargon can kill off your writing. You don't want to become, seems to me, a predictable theorist with dogmatic politics and impenetrable prose. My working class Glasgow father used to say that elites like to talk in fancy language so they can bamboozle people. He had an anti-intellectual strain in him, and I didn't end up agreeing with some of his politics, but he's not wrong about that. And I always like to try and be clear and sharp in my writing, so that the disagreements could be out there, and I can try and engage people, not try and confuse them. So my polemic, I do think it's important to be open to changing your mind. I'm much more uncritical. I'm less critical of academic language than I used to. I do see now that precise language and abstract language that really good theorists do does have more of a place than I used to think. And I also think that social theory, when it goes outside of the sociology seminar and is entered into public debate, can also do harm and have damage. Maybe we could talk about some of that in the questions. But I would also say too that becoming a really good theorist requires listening to and reading people that you disagree with regularly, both academics who you disagree with and have it come from a different tradition, but also talking to political conservatives or people who are politically moderate, or people come from a different political viewpoint. I think if you widen the range of who you listen to, who you talk to, I think it can do a world of good for your theorizing and your writing. So I do think that the good news, I think, is that theory and sociology. Bad news is that the world is in chaos and a mess. The good news is sociology and theory and good writing is more relevant than ever, as peer review loses a lot of legitimacy, and the role of experts are being questioned. I think we can enter into the public sphere with good theorizing and good writing. And I'm very excited about the prospects for sociology. I wouldn't do as I did. I kind of did this by accident. I'm not a good role model for being a theorist today. The theorists on this panel today are much better role models for today. And the CSA has done a really good job in creating mentors for new generations. And I'm really happy to be part of it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all find your own voices and your own unique paths to writing, and I look forward to reading what you write. So thank you.
Amazing. And next we have Renisa Mwani.
Thank you so much to Dean Ray for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and to Sherry and Awish for organizing us, and to the other panelists for their very inspiring remarks. So I should begin with a confession, which is that I'm actually not trained as a sociologist, even though I work in a sociology department. I'm a scholar of colonial legal histories, and so I spend a lot of time in archives. My remarks today are oriented through these interests of colonial legal history and through archival practices, and mostly through experiences of reading, writing, and also teaching. And so just to follow up on Neil's last point, for me, writing is not possible without reading. So I think the advice that he gave is really helpful. So I teach a historical research methods class in which I teach students the relationship between history and sociology, and where we read critical works by Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color, people who have been systematically excluded and misrepresented in archives. And scholars that problematize the archive and have reimagined it in very different ways. In this class, students also do primary research and gain firsthand experience on how to read archival materials. Archival research is not only about retrieving new materials, I argue, and insist to my students, though that is really important and also really exciting. It's also about practices of reading and writing. So why, you might ask, am I starting my presentation in a seminar on writing theory with a discussion of historical research methods? Despite the clear split in the discipline between theory and method, these distinctions are increasingly blurry for me. So when I started at UBC, I thought I was theoretically inclined, maybe not a theorist. Tom Kemple is my colleague, and he was the real theorist, but someone who read widely and engaged with theory. But over the last 10 years, I see myself and my writing more in terms of method, and I'll return to this point more fully in a few minutes. Many of the scholars that I assign in my historical methods class might be classified as theorists, but they're also storytellers, creative writers, and critics of the world, producing new vocabularies and imaginaries. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to just sort of give you a couple of examples through my own writing in terms of how I think about theory through archives. So my first book, Colonial Proximities, was really an engagement with theoretical ideas. I was writing histories of land, labor, and law in British Columbia's contact zone, thinking about the intersections and interrelations between Indigenous people, European settlers, and Chinese migrants. But I was also exploring the limits and possibilities of state racism as conceived by Foucault in the last part of History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and then more fully in his lectures, especially Society Must Be Defended. And as I worked on the book and I engaged more with historians, and as historians read and criticized my work, I started to appreciate the limits of a top-down approach to theory, which is what I really see my first book as being. As I worked with the archival and historical materials with practices of reading and writing, I increasingly realized that this was, for me, writing theory. Even now, the directives I give to graduate students is to focus on empirical research or examples, and to think about the theoretical stakes of their work as it develops. The objective is not to apply theory or to have a separate theory chapter, as Tom pointed out, but to enact it. And this is a process that demands really careful practices of reading, often reading primary texts, and also practices of writing and rewriting. So I want to just turn to an example from my recent book, Across Oceans of Law. And let me just share my screen. Sorry, I'm having a... Okay. Okay. Sorry, you'll just have to see it like this. Okay. So, the map that I'm showing you is based on work that I did in London in 2015 at the British Library, the Carrad Library at Greenwich, and the Guildhall Library. I spent long days plotting the movements of a single ship, the Steubenhoek, built in 1890, the Cecilia, sold in 1892 and renamed in 1894, and the Komagata-Maru, sold and renamed in 1913. And the products of these weeks of reading through the Lloyd's Weekly Shipping Index is this map, with only some voyages. So the map was made by my friend Leopold Lambert, and you can see the different voyages taken by this one ship in dark orange, light orange, and yellow. The way its movements connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic seaboard, to the Pacific, to the Indian Oceans. This map became critical to my thinking and still is. From it, I developed this idea of oceans as method, which is as much a theoretical formulation as a methodological one. So by way of conclusion, let me just read a few passages from the book, in which, from the introduction of Across Oceans of Law, where I formulate and discuss this idea of what oceans as method is. So oceans as vast, dynamic, and ungovernable forces reorient histories of Indian migration in several important ways. First, by drawing attention to the peripatetic movements of vessels, laws, and people, oceans offer novel techniques for writing colonial legal history. Second, as sites of ongoing and ceaseless change, the sea emphasizes motion as central to imperial and colonial politics. Indian travelers, migrants, and radicals viewed the empire through moving global vistas in which land and sea featured as interconnected spaces of anti-colonial struggle. Finally, oceans point to alternative histories of race. Racial regimes of power were not static, mutable, or fixed in land and territory alone. Rather, they were the potent effects of maritime circulations and collisions that generated changing forms and intensities of colonial violence, opposition, and anti-colonial struggle. When viewed oceanically, the Komagata-Maru's passage vividly demonstrates the jurisdictional workings of race as a foundational structure of colonial and imperial command, one that demarcated people, differentiated populations, and divided seas from continental regions. to trace the circulations of colonial law and Indian radicalism, and to draw connections between the seemingly discrepant histories and geographies of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. The book draws on oceans and currents as its guiding methodology. Ocean currents exercise a very important influence not only in climate, but also on commerce, wrote one source in 1893. The seas join the nations they divide. Though movement is constantly occurring, but not often visible on land, oceans bear the ocular, audible, and palpable marks of motion and change. Currents, as oceanographers and others argue, are made up of vertical, horizontal, and circuitous movements that mark the surface of the sea and also its subterranean depths. Currents are not singular or unidirectional, but heterogeneous and plural. They connect the ocean regions that have long been divided in European thought. Surface currents, cross currents, undercurrents, and rip currents move in multiple directions with changing velocities and intensities depending on season, temperature, and climate. Precisely because of their active and powerful force, the sea never stops moving. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ranisa. And last but not least, we have Zohreh Bayatrizi.
Hi, thank you, Dean and Sherry, and everyone who's been involved in organizing this. I am going to be in Awish, sorry, I forgot your name. I'm going to be really brief because one, a lot of what I wanted to say was already much more eloquently than I could ever do it said and discussed by the previous panelists. So thank you to them. And I have learned from them over the years and continue to learn from them. And the other reason I want to be brief is that I think the Q&A is and should be a very important part of this. So I want to leave more time for it as much as possible. So like Neil, I want to start with my own experience of how I came to theory. And like millions of undergraduate sociology students around the world, when I was studying at the University of Tehran, we had a classical social theory course and a contemporary social theory course. And over the years, I have come to be very critical of the ways in which we divide theory into classical and contemporary, but that's a discussion for another day. But in the classical social theory course, it was a second-year course, and it was my first exposure to theory. We read Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and Tonis, and Wilfredo Pareto, and Zimmel, and I was fascinated as an undergraduate by the ways in which these theorists were all looking at the same thing, which was the major, massive upheavals of Western Europe in the 19th century and the preceding centuries. And yet each of them was seeing a different thing. And it's important to note that this was in the 1990s and in post-revolutionary post-war Iran. And the political climate was that there is only one way of looking at things, and there is one right way, and everything else is wrong. There is only one right belief, and one right ideology, and one right set of values. And I had never been convinced by that official political stance. And when I started reading social theory, I loved it from the beginning because exactly of this diversity of voices, and because I saw, contrary to everything that our government had tried to tell us, that there are more than one valid ways of looking at the world, and that is the beauty of social theory for me. And they think that beyond any particular things in any particular theorist's work, the one big thing that I've taken from social theory is that there are many different ways of looking at the same reality and seeing different things. And I don't so much think that social theorists are opposed to one another or have conflicting views. I just think that they have very complementary views. And so I like Marx as much as I like Durkheim or Weber or Pierre Bourdieu or Michel Foucault and others. And so I think today, this is an important thing to consider in terms of what we do with theory. And as Tom mentioned, I don't really consider theory a tool for explaining or testing a particular hypothesis. But I think there are many, many uses in theory. And one of them, which is particularly instructive today, is this promotion of diversity of views and opinions and tolerance and nuance, because both politically and academically, the Western world has become, especially in Canada and the US, which I have more experience of, and I shouldn't speak of Europe because I don't know, but it seems like the world around me in Canada and in the US is reverting back to what I was experiencing in Iran after the revolution, which is only one thing can be true and only one thing can be right and only one set of beliefs are right. The emergence of populism and of cancel culture, and all of these are both in academia and in politics and society, are really worrying. And so I hope that we see in theory an invitation to see things differently, to change our perspectives, to see things from multiple points of view, and to be more tolerant. And the same is with literature as well. So I just want to invite people to find theory that they like, that they find easy to read. And I know that a lot of theory is very dense and difficult to read, but find something to read that you like and is simple and is interesting, and read it, and then go read something else. And don't expect it to solve any of the problems of the world. One of the things I tell my students when I teach is that there are a set of objectives that I put on the syllabus, and that's for the department. And there is a real objective that I have in this course, and it's for us to realize that we don't know anything, and that it's okay to not know anything, and it's okay to not have a final answer to things. And this is an antidote to dogmatism and ideology of all kinds. And now in terms of, so that was my first encounter with theory, but later on as an academic, as a graduate student, and then later as an academic, I've also had different encounters with theory. And a lot of what I think about theory was already mentioned by Tom and Renissa and Katherine. So I don't want to go, I had something written up, but I don't want to discuss it so much anymore because it was already talked about. But I can say this, that I have never gone into the social world with a theory and trying to see if the social world essentially approves or disproves or credits or discredits that theory. So I will stop here, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Zohreh. I want to begin by thanking all of our panelists for an exceptionally rich conversation about writing theory. We have some wonderful questions in the I guess it's like a Q&A box. So I'll go ahead and I'll just read a few of them. If you have more questions, feel free to put them in as well. So Ariana Hannemeyer hearts metaphors, but she's also reticent. So I'll speak in her voice. My question is for Drs. Kempel and Bischoping, and it's about the political commitments of metaphor. One of the charges against writing theory in sociology is that theorists are some obscurantist bunch with vague or abstract ideas that don't serve to clarify the state of affairs or description explanation of the social world. Also, metaphors are rooted in culture, and so can implicitly exclude those without the often canonical knowledge needed to understand. How can we use language and metaphor for clarity, relying less on those cultural tropes for theory to be public-facing and inclusive? So I'll just remind the panelists to raise your hand, and then I'll call upon you to speak. Go for it, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ariane. Well, I do think that metaphors and images are one of the ways in which we do make theory public-facing. Of course, there's a distinction between a concept and a metaphor. I saw that Laura asked a question about that. But in some ways, I think of concepts and theories as making use of metaphors. And when I tune my ears and focus my eyes on those aspects of a text, of an argument, of a discourse, then new things come out of that. And in the case that I presented, I didn't get into it in my remarks, but when Zimmel uses the image or the analogy or the metaphor of the plumb line, he's describing his own method. He's also articulating his own theory. Unfortunately, it's lost in our English translations. So I do warn you that. I can show you where that is if you ever look at my book. It's there where that metaphor gets lost. But he says we're sort of like dropping like a lead sinker into the depths of the city and into the depths of our own spirit and soul and our experience of the city. I think thinking like that, rather than in the broad terms of hypertrophy and atrophy, or even metropolis and mental life, which can be almost impossible abstractions on first encounter, but thinking more in terms of surfaces and depths is one way in which we can expand the vocabulary and the image repertoire of theoretical writing and speaking.
Yes, Kathy.
Yeah, that is such an interesting question, and I'm very intrigued by Thomas's answer, and I want to go back to Zimmel. So I guess one of my answers to the question, or one of the thoughts that it evokes in me is that there's some really interesting work on cross-cultural differences in metaphor. For example, a project that I saw looking at Hmong migrants to the United States who were not getting their kids vaccinated against measles. I think this was back in the 70s or something. So it was a project working with that community to understand the metaphors through which they saw measles, and learning that they saw measles as kind of a rash that's kind of like a plant that's growing. There's seeds that need to grow. There's a natural course that this takes. So it was kind of okay, how do we work with that system of metaphors to present vaccination in a way that could be more acceptable to that community? So so that's one thought that came to mind. Another is that I think often we are fascinated by differences in language use and metaphor and cross-cultural comparisons of that. Often people, when they get into that conversation of like, oh, why do Germans have the word Schadenfreude, which means happiness and sorrow, like nobody else has that word. You know, people often enjoy that kind of conversation about language. I have a fond memory of a friend from Finland saying to me, somebody had looked at her as though she was a cheap sausage. And even though I'd never heard that metaphor before, the idea of looking at someone like a cheap sausage immediately attracted me. So I think people have a little bit more tolerance, perhaps, for cultural variation in metaphor, and that we could give them credit for that curiosity and use metaphors that derive from our cultures and maybe explain them to different audiences. And then my final thought is to kind of flip the question around a little, because Lee Miracle, my go-to again in this talk, is talking about how metaphors in our languages come from and evoke the environment in which we're found. So that Simmel uses a plumb line, says something about Simmel's environment. So there's some way that if we want to speak to a variety of communities, then finding out what is the metaphor, what's the language in which I can best reach this community can be an interesting way and a way to represent a community that's not often represented. So that's kind of a mixed bag of answers that I have. Sorry, it's a bit of a mess.
Yes, Renisa.
So I guess I'll approach this question in a slightly different way, and that is that when I think of metaphor, I often can't separate it from materiality. And so when we think about the ship or the ocean, right, which is both used metaphorically in many ways. So Kathy pointed out the sort of the metaphor of waves to describe the different points of the pandemic, but also, that water is a material force that, we're becoming more aware of with rising sea levels, for example. So the materiality is, for me, really difficult to disentangle. And when you're thinking about something like the ocean, you realize that, in fact, different communities have very different sort of relationships, both imaginary and also material, to the ocean, right? And so I'm thinking of the very famous essay by Apeli Huafa about a sea of islands, or I'm thinking about the ocean in Hindu mythology as being the Kalapani, or the black waters that one is supposed to fear and not cross, or what oceans mean for pirates, for example. So I think that it's often interesting to sort of think critically about the metaphor itself as identifying a certain kind of environment, as Kathy pointed to, or a time, or a community. And that might actually be a way of sort of addressing the questions that were just raised about culture and about accessibility.
Wonderful. I'm just going to try to weave some questions together. One is from Jared. He's asking, does theory or social science generally play a role in regaining public trust? And does academic ideology as spread specifically over social media disrupt the public's trust? And then there's another question by Laura Servage, which is about the difference, or what is it? The difference between sort of metaphor and theory. And I think that's an important question. And then one by Angela Philippe, I hope I pronounced that right, which is asking what other places other than journals can we create social theory or have social theory? And I just want to preface this by pointing to an article by Tim Hallett, Orla Stapleton, and Michael Sauter. It's called Public Ideas, Their Varieties and Careers. And they basically go through and see which sociological concepts have gotten the most play in popular discourse, specifically newspapers like the New York Times. And it's just interesting to think of the concepts that have actually played out publicly. So we have the bell curve, of course. We have the second shift by Hochschild. And we have the Clash of Civilizations by Huntington. And we have Bowling Alone and the idea of sort of like being by yourself in modern culture. And it's really interesting because all of those are metaphors, and they've all penetrated the sort of global public sphere of intellectual ideas and become bridging metaphors that people actually use not only in media discourse, but in their everyday lives. So giving that a thought, right? How can we sort of build bridges beyond social theory and generate conversations about theoretical ideas? Yes, go for it, Zohreh.
I don't know if I can answer all or even any of these questions, but in line with what I just said in my presentation, I don't think there is one way, one right way to use social theory publicly, or whether it's right or wrong generally. I can point to historical examples of how political activists or community activists might have tried to enact certain ideas. If we are thinking about theory in particular, so for my master's thesis, I studied how the notion of the public sphere and the importance of civil society in the creation of democracy, kind of an idea that is somewhat rooted in Habermas, how this idea was borrowed by some public intellectuals and made into a political platform to win an election, a presidential election in 1997. And they tried to implement this with varying degrees of success. And then there is also afterwards the politicization of Weber as a tool to oppose autocratic government in Iran. So I've written about that as well. There are also nasty and totally ruinous ways in which people have used theory as a political tool. I don't think there is a right way or a wrong way. What I have problem with is that I think in academia, what we are trying to do is different than what is done in the world of politics. Here we are experimenting with ideas, experimenting with ways of knowing and ways of understanding the world. And we are protected by academic freedom, at least in Canada we are. And so we can actually explore things and not be afraid, of especially the practical consequences of what we say or what we write about. And for better or for worse, very few people read what we write. And so I think the world of academic scholarship, and especially theorizing, has a completely different dynamic and rules than when you take those concepts and try to make it a slogan for a social movement. And a lot of that has been done recently in some of the current social movements in Canada and the US. And I personally worry about that, because in the social world, you're actually, like in politics, if you win power, you're going to do things. And if your inspiration for those things come from the academic world, the theoretical world, then you have to know that world is very experimental. It's not a world in which we are trying to come up with solutions for the world. We are coming up with ideas, and we are experimenting with ideas. And sometimes these ideas seep gradually over decades into political contestations and community movements and so on and so forth, after they have been discussed a long time and very gradually and very slowly. But this idea of, again, using theory as a tool, I think it can be very, very dangerous and can be very anti-theory. Especially because the world of politics is a world of certainties, which is so anti-theoretical.
great. Other responses from our panelists? Okay, I will read a question from our colleague Mervyn Horgan. Great session. Wonderful to hear reflections from colleagues at the top of their game. Thank you all so much. Each of you have spoken to the utility of examples, illustration, and metaphor and analogy. Agree wholeheartedly, Mervyn says. What about generalizing, he puts in quotes? This is the very thing that makes theory potentially usable and subject to critique across contexts. So what about generalization? And then my favorite question that comes from Ariane, how do you teach conceptualization as a writing practice? How do you train your students to conceptualize their objects of analysis? Do you have practical hands-on techniques that you found helpful for improving students' work? So I'll leave those two questions with our panelists. Feel free to go for it.
I think there were a couple other questions that were kind of bundled together with the previous ones that I don't know if they got answered. So just drawing attention to that.
Yeah, for sure. Any questions that you would like to answer as well, feel free. Go for it, Tom.
I would just say that I think that generalization is overrated. And that if we can't think with particulars, and that doesn't necessarily mean with, with bundles of examples or sustained examples, but if we can't think with particulars, then we're not actually thinking. So that might be an addendum to my colleague, to my answer, my thinking about my colleague's question, that theory is thinking without examples. So that would seem to mean that it's only a bunch of abstractions or generalizations. I really think it's certainly not that. So, and to maybe touch on Ariana's point, is that is how I do teach in class. I think it's not just about the metaphors, because students, undergrads, don't even know what a metaphor is, even when I try to explain it to them. They know what an image is, they know how, they know when I'm using one, they just don't know what it is. But I think, well, let's think about the example, right? The example of how oceans work, right? Is that something we can think with? What a current is, what waves are, what depths and surfaces are? Is that helpful in some way for thinking about a global capitalism, for example? And it is, both in the literal way, but also in a theoretical way. So this particulars are friends, I think, and not something to be left behind once we reach the abstraction.
Wonderful. Renisa?
I'm I'm really opposed to this idea of generalization and generalizability, in part because I think that, that's how much of theory in the Western European and Eurocentric tradition has been written, right? As this kind of generalizable to every place and everyone and every part of the globe. And so when I teach, to get to the other question, it's really about the particularity. And one of my favorite courses that I only just started teaching a few years ago is my historical methods class, because we have we work with primary texts. We analyze not just sort of the content, but also the form of a text. And students are encouraged to do work that they get feedback on over a period of 10 weeks, so that they can revise and redevelop and sort of reread and rethink their arguments, and much the way that Neil was suggesting that we think about writing. And so, but it is always about the particular. And, with graduate students, when if a student starts with some big grand gesture, it's always about, let's get back to the particularity of what you're writing about.
Such great points. And just to let everybody know, we're going to go until 11:15, so there is a bit more time to answer some of those questions that maybe have become submerged. Is there anybody else that would like to respond to the ideas of generalizability or of how to train students to theorize and to write theoretically? I see. Okay, there's lots of questions here. Go for it, Neil. Are you raising your hand? Oh no, okay.
Can we address the question about COVID and the pandemic and what does it mean to do theory at the time that we're experiencing health harms and constant changes? You know, I just want to sort of respond to that in two ways. The first is that I think this is a really important moment to think about the significance of history and why it is that certain communities, Indigenous, Black, and communities of color are more vulnerable to COVID and its so-called complications. And you know, so this is something that we've been talking about at length, or that have found myself really sort of preoccupied with over the last year. And then the other, you know, the other equally important point about COVID is the way in which it makes visible what's been unseen. And I'm thinking specifically about shipping, right? And the ways in which the pandemic itself sort of erupted on cruise ships, what this has meant for, you know, what the pandemic has meant for this, for supply chains and for delays. And so in many ways, you know, it's become this opportunity to see what we haven't been able to see or what we've been ignoring for so long, whether that's infrastructure or whether it's history.
Absolutely, that's such a good point. And that question comes from Alan Martineau. Kathy, and then Zohreh.
Yeah, early on in the pandemic, a group of faculty at Wilfrid Laurier University wrote an essay collection looking at societal and government responses to the pandemic. So this came out in April of last year. They were very quick off the mark. And I'm going to put the link to an article about that into the chat. But I think for me, some of the most interesting works on theorizing in COVID times have first come from Indigenous Twitter, like reading Kim Tallbear on Twitter, for example, and also in a rather different vein, articles talking about the changing nature of how we experience time and why those changes are. So those have been some of the things that I've noticed have been most interesting.
What I want to add to that is that two things. One is that every time something big happens, we get asked, what should we do about this? What can we do? How can we fight this? How can we fight that? So I remember in 2016, right after Trump was elected, we had a theory thing in my department, and we were asked, how can we fight this back? Our job is to teach and do research. We as theorists, it's not our job to fight anything in particular. Now, as individuals, we might want to go out there and protest or do certain things, but I don't think we are responsible or should feel responsible to fight on all the fronts and be at the forefront of every crisis, political or biological or political biological, as COVID is. Having said that, there might actually be something that we can do depending on the person and depending on what they do. Again, academically speaking, I don't want to presume too much about our ability to change the world. And I don't even know if the world was in our control, we would do a good job any better than it's done right now. But, you know, academically speaking, there are certain things that we might be able to do. So for instance, post-COVID, there were two things that came to my mind that I could maybe inquire about. And I began, in fact, writing about both. One is COVID is a contagion, right? So I went back to Mary Douglas and I read her work, her big thing, and then from the 1960s, and then later on she wrote about AIDS, for instance, in the 1980s in the US. So another kind of contagion, and the politics of the contagion. And I began thinking about contagion as something that's not just biological, but social and political. So I kind of wrote a piece about the biological, social, and political aspects of contagion in relation to COVID in Iran, but kind of situating it in the context of global politics and of the countries that, the rich countries and the middle income countries and countries that have normal trade relations versus Iran, which is under sanctions during a pandemic, and all of that. And so that piece is going to come out in Current Sociology at some point soon. And then there is another thing, is grief. And so we know that the pandemic causes many kinds of grief, whether you lose people or whether just you kind of miss your normal life, going to work, partying, whatever it is that people lose because of the pandemic. And the grief impacts people very differently. So again, I thought about this in terms of the global nature of it and how this grief, this grievability, as Butler talks about, is distributed in the world very unequally. Where in Canada, there was so much controversy, and rightfully so, about the breakouts in long-term care homes for the elderly. Whereas if we look at it around the world, so many people of all ages and all ethnicities and social backgrounds are dying at a much higher rate than in Canada. And yet Canada is hoarding vaccines and is, trying to be at the forefront of getting the most vaccines possible. And because we think that the lives of Canadians are grievable, whereas the rest are essentially waste, as Bauman calls them, that you could just they're just born to die and they die anyway. So who cares? And and I also taught a course a course on sociological and theoretical perspectives on death and dying, where we discussed COVID and we discussed the unequal distribution of life and death and grief and vulnerability around the world. But I did these not because I felt a kind of mission or responsibility to respond to COVID as the latest crisis, but because it actually happens to be the thing that I do. And COVID essentially opened my eyes on more critical ways of looking at the sociology of death and dying. I see there was another question that was addressed to me, and if you guys don't mind, I'll just.
Zohreh, just one point. I know that Sherry has to take a little time to reset in order to get the workshop set up for us. I know Neil raised his hand, so maybe we'll just give Neil a word and then I can wrap up. Thank you so much, though. And Sherry has also said that we can answer any of these questions on the CSA Social Theory website. So if you've asked a question here and it hasn't been answered, we'll make sure to get it to the panelists and post it there. Go ahead, Neil.
I very much agree with Zohreh's point about focusing on what our job is. And I think, I guess what I worry about maybe it hasn't been very calm, obviously the COVID crisis, but it could be a little bit of a calm before the storm that's coming. I think you're going to see austerity. You're going to see attacks on professors accelerating. The appalling events of Laurentian. I mean, I think we need to be really seriously thinking about the economics of higher education and be more careful about what we're doing on Twitter and how we're presenting the discipline. I think it's a serious issue. There's a lot of great work on Twitter and there's a lot of great things that can happen, but I think we're seriously underestimating the nastiness that's out there that the ways that we're going to be made a target by bad actors. But we don't want to, I think there's too many unforced errors out there on our side. And I think we have to give some serious thought to those issues. So thank you for this amazing panel and being invited to it. I really enjoyed it. So.
That's wonderful, Neil. And social theory has made us a target for political attacks. Jordan Peterson has weaponized cultural Marxism, a very niche theoretical idea. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank so much Sherry for organizing this, and I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank Awish for all of the help with promotion and for making this event so wonderful and so meaningful to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. And I will see our workshop panelists in about 10 minutes.